On today's episode of The Story Detective, we have Zoe again. Zoe, YouTube, this is Zoe. Every time I sit down to do a video now, she's up here. So, we are going to be doing the Has Steve Read It tag. If you haven't seen the tag, Steve Donoghue is a booktuber, and he's reputed to be the most well-read guy on Booktube, easily. And Matthew from Mayberry Book Club started a tag. Since Steve has read so much, he started pulling books off of his shelf to see if he could find something that Steve hasn't read. So far, the record holder is Samuel Derham with 3 books that Steve hasn't read. Steve says this tag should be changed to the "What does Steve think of this?" Meantime, he says he doesn't read everything, but at the end of the video, he will say, "Come on, YouTube, you can do better than that." So he's encouraging us to stump him while kind of admitting what we have he's most likely read. So I have some things today, and I'm hoping to get his opinion on what he thinks of some things, as well as trying to stump him. So let's see if we can fuse these things together and have a little fun. That's what's coming up on today's episode. Stick around. It's snowing outside, it's cold as hell, it's the perfect day to cozy up with a hot beverage and your favorite YouTube videos or your favorite book. And we're going to see if we can have some fun today and stump Steve with at least a couple of them. If you haven't watched Steve's channel, I'm going to link it in the description box below because I think you should. As writers, and mainly I'm putting out videos for writers here, that you can gain a lot of reading material from a guy like Steve. And since you're supposed to read widely, you will find things that you've probably never heard of. And that's good for writers. So head over to Steve's channel, subscribe, and watch some videos, get some book recommendations, and you'll be the better for it. What I did coming at this is most people are taking 8 or 10 books off their shelves. So I picked 10 books in different categories. I picked a couple of intentionally bad books, at least books that I feel aren't that well written, in hopes that maybe Steve wouldn't get through them. I picked a couple of pulpish books, because comic books and pulp fiction, that's something that I read in the past, and probably Steve has as well, but we'll see. I also picked some literary works and some nonfiction works. So part of this, as I said, is going to be, can we stump Steve on a couple of things he hasn't read, and also, what has he thought of these books if he has? I've seen people come up with books that they've written or family members have written and wondering if Steve actually read their work. So I thought in that vein, I would also put in a shameless plug for something that I worked on. Since he reads comic books, I am going to put The Thing from Another World, Climate of Fear. This was one of the first projects that I ever worked on. I was still in art school at the time. A friend of mine got a job with Dark Horse Comics, and I inked some of his stuff on vellum. What happened is the original inker assigned to this project did a really bad job and ticked off the vice president of Dark Horse Comics, who just happened to have my friends and my samples in front of him. And he picked up my stuff and said, "Give it to this guy." So I ended up getting a job. It starts out really bad. I inked this book and I cut my teeth as far as quill and brush inking this. So from the first issue to the last issue, it looks like 2 different people inked it. But it's all me and my progression of learning as I ended up with, one of my first professional jobs. This book also, since it's based on a sequel to the John Carpenter movie, The Thing, which has a cult following, this odd little project survived over the years. In fact, there's a YouTube video where people took this book, used the art to illustrate it, and the dialogue, and put together a full cast audio with sound effects and different readers, and I thought that's pretty cool that the cult following of the movie has made this project survive. So my question is, has Steve read it? I will also leave a link to the fan full cast because I know some people like audio and I think that's kind of fun, so I'll leave a link to that in the description below as well. And this is getting into some of the couple of lesser quality books that I'm thinking Steve probably hasn't read. The Messenger by Donald Tyson. Now this book, why is it still on my shelf? I went to a discount bookstore at one point and it was coming towards fall. This is put out by Llewellyn Publishing, which has a lot of spiritually oriented books, and they came out with a series of novels that deal with psychic, supernatural phenomenon, and I thought this will be my fall read for October. And I picked up 3 or 4 of their books. They were only like $2 or $3 each, I think. The other 3 that I picked up are no longer on my shelf because they were just a mixed bag of crap. This was the only one that was actually kind of fun. And so I kept it because if you like the idea of haunted houses, there's an entity attached to the house. People go in that are psychics, spiritualists, and ghost chasers to try to make contact and get rid of the entity. It has all the typical things that you would expect to find, and I think a little bit more. It's not terribly well written if I look past the mediocre writing. So I kept this just for those purposes. Again, has Steve actually read this one? It's called The Case of Cabin 13 by Sam McCarver. This series has what I thought was an interesting concept. I was very much into mysteries when I bought this book, and I picked up a few of his. He has everything from books in Victorian London that have Arthur Conan Doyle and seances to things like this, murder mysteries on the Titanic. What I discovered is his main character, John Darnell, and his girlfriend, Penny, are as cliched could be. They have every cliche that you see in an old movie that was cliched in the 1940s, but he reproduces it here. Every book, Penny plays the victim. She's used as bait. She's thrown into this situation where she's a helpless woman. It's terrible. In fact, let me read you the opening line. This is the worst opening line, I think, on record because there are so many adjectives. It evokes nothing but adjectivitis. Professor John Darnell smiled as he poked his way along through the clammy opaqueness of the thick, moist fog, using his black umbrella as a walking stick. Could he squeeze any more adjectives into that line? I'm guessing Steve wouldn't get past the first line of this. So I'm throwing it in. If you want to look at something that encourages you, that makes you know you can do it, then I highly recommend this book. So book number 4. This comes from an era when I was freelancing, doing those graphic novels like the first book. And when I did that, I was putting in quite often 12 to 15 hour days. So my writing would be getting up early in the morning and writing between 6 and 7, sometimes for an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, and reading for about an hour to an hour and a half before I went to bed. So I got a lot of audio, and I listened to the audio while I was working. Amongst the audio, I got caught up in old-time radio shows. There were a lot of cliched stories. There were some good ideas, but I loved the period because comic books came from the 1940s, and that's when a lot of the radio shows were on. Like I said, some were good, some were bad. There was a radio show called I Love a Mystery, and it was by Carlton E. Morse. They were very much high adventure, and I went into a bookstore at one point, and I found this, because I discovered that Carlton E. Morse in his later years spent his time writing novels, and this was a novelization of one of his I Love a Mystery radio shows. Most of his radio shows were lost to the ages and were never found again, but here is a novelization of one of the lost radio shows, so I picked it up. A little bit pulpy, a little bit obscure. As I said, I read various pulp things back in the days when I was working on comics like The Shadow, The Saint by Leslie Charteris, all these things that at the time were kind of a bit of history for me in the field that I was working in. Again, has Steve taken this journey? Has he read widely enough to get into radio shows and some of the people who have worked on them? The Husband by Saul Stein. Now, Saul Stein was a former writing mentor of mine, and this was his first novel. Saul Stein wrote plays before he wrote novels. He was also an editor and ran his own publishing house. Now, this was supposed to be a play. Somehow the play got turned down or things went awry. He went home with his play, pretty pissed off. And he sat down and he turned it into a novel. He wrote this in a month. This was Saul Stein's NaNoWriMo project before there was a NaNoWriMo. But he already had the characters, he had the setting, he had the dialogue. He just had to flesh it out. It's not a badly written novel as far as that goes, but it's not his best either. He wrote this in a hurry. He wrote it angrily, but it got published. After he published this, he came up with the idea of what could I do if I really took my time, and he wrote The Magician, which sold over 1 million copies. The Magician was a book that was picked up by a lot of high schools because it's about teenage gangs in high schools. The book does have a scene or two that alludes to sex. There is nothing that's explicit within this book. The Parent Committee for Decency got a hold of it and said, oh my gosh, he's talking about sex to our children who are now in their teens, and teens, of course, don't have sex in the 70s. And the book was forever banned, which was a crime because it's a well-written book. And it also launched his lawyer character, George Tomasi. And you can buy that book in audio now, but I don't think you can buy, there's never been a printed copy unless you find one in a used bookstore. But getting back to his first novel, The Husband, this is the one that we're asking if Steve actually read. This is probably the least known and hardest to find, so there may be a chance that Steve hasn't read it. Is The Understudy by Elia Kazan. Now, if you don't know who Elia Kazan is, he was a director of plays and film. His production of A Streetcar Named Desire starred Marlon Brando in his breakout role. His movie about Steinbeck's East of Eden was the first movie that James Dean played in, so he launched a lot of big careers. In the 1950s, there were a lot of communist witch hunts, and Elia Kazan, being an Armenian immigrant, decided he was going to help, and he named names, and that got him blacklisted in Hollywood. And this, I believe, is his second novel, and it's actually edited by Saul Stein. Kazan and Stein became pretty good friends. Kazan brought everything that he knew about directing to the table and turned out to be a pretty fair writer as well. And under Stein's editorial eyes, I think they put together a well-crafted project. This was also published in the early to mid-70s. And it shouldn't surprise you that it's a novel about theater. It's about a young actor, an understudy, who covets an older actor's role, kind of wants to take his place. This is definitely another one that I'm curious as to whether Steve has read and what he's thought of it. We're going to take a look at someone else, Bud Schulberg, who's probably not known to a lot of people here, but he was a screenwriter, a TV producer, and a novelist. This was his debut novel. It was published in the 1940s. This novel was what they called a runaway success. For someone who is a young novelist, he could never beat what this novel did. It did everything good, and he tried to do several relaunches of his novelist career, but he could never match up to his first novel. So that's an interesting story, I think, in terms of someone who is accomplished in other media. He couldn't actually outdo himself. So as a writer, that could be a warning, and that's happened to a lot of people if they have too much success right out the gate, and that's something that, again, time has proven can become detrimental. But I'm wondering if Steve read this and what he's thought of it. Call It Sleep by Henry Roth. Now, this book was originally written in the 1930s. I think it was published in 1934. This is a reprint from 64 or 65. And it's a paperback with rounded corners, which is very unusual. This book, when it first came out, didn't do very well. Roth was a Hungarian immigrant, and he lived briefly with his family as a child in the slums of Brooklyn's East Side. And this book is based on his childhood when they first moved to America. And he was a kid that didn't speak English, and he's getting lost in the city, found by police who can't understand a word he's saying. And this was sort of a fictionalized autobiography. In the 60s, this book was rediscovered by a man named Harold Ribelow. And it was reprinted because Ribelow thought it deserved a second chance. The second chance actually made Roth pretty famous for this book, and it broke out and did quite well. Now this, if it sounds like the term they use for Moriarty, that's because this was the man that Conan Doyle based Professor Moriarty on. He had an organization, a gang of criminals that spanned from Europe to the United States. What they did, how they got away with it. This is interesting because, number one, I'm a Sherlock Holmes fan. Secondly, how these things operated through history, which is always interesting. It's also, I thought, amusing to find that Conan Doyle took a lot from life. Now, this wasn't the only thing he took from life. On a visit to the United States, he was friends with the Pinkerton brothers. The Pinkertons were very famous private eyes. If you haven't heard of them, then I suggest you look them up. But one of the Pinkerton brothers, I can't remember which one, was friends with Conan Doyle. and he told Conan Doyle in detail this story that he was going to write up himself on this investigation. Conan Doyle went back and he wrote it up as a Sherlock Holmes story called The Valley of Fear. And from what I understand, he wrote it almost verbatim to what Pinkerton told him. So of course Pinkerton was totally pissed, and when his book came out, it did nothing, while Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes novel was selling like hotcakes. So I don't know what that did to their friendship long term, but I don't think it helped it. But this was definitely an interesting book, and again, I'm wondering if Steve has read it and what he thought. Children of the Dark by Alan Gallup. Now this book, I don't know if it was actually brought to the United States. I bought it in the UK, and I stumbled on it while looking through a bookstore. And again, looking at history from that time period, the labor laws, and how they had children working in mines underground. They were pulling carts that were attached to them by a harness like they were animals. It's grueling, but historically, it's definitely an interesting book, and how children were mistreated in terms of business and making money. I was at the time looking into how they were treated in factories, and I picked up some books on that score too when I came across this. Has Steve read it? There's a chance, but definitely it's something you would have to go looking for, so maybe he hasn't. I hope you've had fun with this, that maybe you've learned a couple of things and found a few obscurities in these selections, or some interesting choices that you may want to read. So until next time, keep those pages turning, and I will see you on the next episode of The Story Detective.